it's surprisingly easy and actually very common to self-actualize a false version of you, to self-actualize a persona. And the issue with this is that it's very discreet. It's often something that can pass you by unnoticed. It's something that can, through the process, feel authentic. When you begin to move towards a curated image, when you begin to move towards the idea of how you should be, and this is the idea also of how the ego adapts very quickly to stay relevant. So let's take the example of spiritual ego, right? The idea of becoming who you are, of self-actualizing within that context. Now, it could be that you become aware of all your so-called spiritual failings. You're not mindful enough. You're not compassionate enough. You're not grateful enough. You don't meditate well enough, whatever that might be. The idea of true inner work is to bring awareness to the nature of the self, to bring acceptance to it, and allow qualities to emerge. But if you start to develop an image of, well, I'm this type of person, and you become more of an assessment, right? With a conscious mind, or maybe the subconscious mind, there's an assessment of, this is how I see myself. This is what I should be like. And along the way, when faced with the choice between authenticity and what I should be like, you very subtly start to deviate towards the should, right? And this is what Karen Horney describes as the tyranny of shoulds. You may have heard of it. It's a fascinating concept. But the idea that along that way, along the path of actualizing and bringing forward what feels true, we start to make micro adjustments that actually lead us off track. Now, there's nothing essentially wrong with that process. That's something that I've done and will likely continue to do along the way, because ultimately there's a sense of trial and error. And at times you're going to start to move in one direction, and it's only actually the realization that doesn't feel right that you then kind of align even more with what feels true through the process of knowing what isn't. So it's not something to be judged, but it is something to be aware of, because for a lot of people there can be a process of becoming involved in spiritual growth, self-improvement, and they actually become even more inauthentic through the process. And the tragedy of that is if there's a self-deceit through that, right? If the process of inner communication between what is true and what is being actualized breaks down to the extent that the entire process is hijacked by the image of the ideal, how you should be as a spiritual person, how you should be as a conscious person. Part of the way to overcome this is self-honesty, to really check in throughout your life, throughout your interactions with other people, the way that you're engaging with the world, the way you're engaging with your own inner experience, the shadow experience, the myriad of thoughts and feelings and sensations and desires. To just be really honest with where you're at and how you're representing that inner landscape. And keep in mind as well that we are social beings, right? We're not here to just really always acknowledge and fully express all of our kind of self-centered desires at the expense of other people. There is the need for a skillful intermediary in the way that we are and how we're communicating. That's part of the process. But the more that there's an element of self-honesty, the more you can see those mini distortions and the tendency to convince yourself that you're in the process of authentic self-actualization, when in actuality, you are trying to become the image of perfection or the image of the ideal, whatever that might be. Something that you can do, a practice that you can try to help with this process is just to, through free association, get your journal and write down, what is my ideal self? What do I feel I should be like? and just see what comes up. See what things surface through that process. And that might give you an idea of when you're going off track. To return to this idea of the spiritual ego, and for example, the idea of being compassionate, being a spiritually evolved person who is very compassionate towards other people. Now, you might realize that you have an idea, I should be compassionate. That starts to crystallize as a concept, and you're trying to actualize the image of what a compassionate person looks like. So you notice that in certain situations, you've conflated this concept of compassion with what feels true. And as a result, compassion becomes this kind of muddied experience of perhaps not having boundaries, of perhaps being overgiving, or even lacking in self-compassion. Often this can manifest in the relationship to certain emotions. So for example, as a spiritual person, I shouldn't be angry results in not the actualization of some kind of assertive ability to represent yourself with clarity, but actually an avoidance of anger, a denial of anger that leads to a persona which can be a bit sterile, can be a bit detached from the righteousness and the value of anger as a tool to be understood and used in relevant contexts. So this is just touching upon this idea of actualizing a false image of the self. And really the best way to understand that is just to be really clear within yourself, to be diligent with what behavior am I bringing forward? Is that true? Is it authentic? Is it based on an idea of how I should be? Or is there a deeper truth to how I'm being? Most of us do have an intuitive sense of when we're being honest, of when we're being dishonest, of when we're stepping out of that line. And the key with this process is to constantly look back on and reflect on the times when you're making decisions that do feel true. Sometimes decisions feel true, behaviors feel true that turn out to be a slight deviation in the track, but that's part of the process of genuine self-actualization, which is ultimately lifelong.